Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're at. My name is Chris Hughes, and I am the founder and CEO of The Way Forward. Welcome to today's our inaugural episode for our podcast, which we hope to do here on a more frequent basis in order to bring in key leaders to talk about things that are important to senior leaders in organizations, leadership teams, and those who are just developing along their career paths. Today, we have Dr. Jim Martin with us. Jim is a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Army. When he retired, he got his PhD in American history from the University of Texas, Austin, as he puts it. He taught at West Point, taught history for many years, and then migrated to the Army University at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. In his time there, he became the Dean of Academics for Army University, the senior academician of the university, of one of the largest universities in the world. Jim and I have a relationship there, having moved there after being in the 3rd Infantry Division in Afghanistan. I was given the privilege of getting to work with Jim as the Deputy Commandant or the Provost of the Army University. So today, Jim and I are going to talk about a number of different topics, and I'm going to pick his brain, and hopefully there'll be some things that a recent colleague of his said, wow, that's pretty profound. I've never heard of that before. Things that are common for Jim and I and our experience, having grown up in the Army and having many life experiences through academics, through field application, and hands-on leadership and development with young developing humans in the United States Army, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. So, Jim, Dr. Martin, welcome. Welcome to today's podcast.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you letting me join you.
Well, I appreciate you being our first. I couldn't think of a better person to have come in than my old favorite mentor, who now in retirement, we get a chance to work together on other projects as well as this. And so if you would, any historical things I need to fill in the blanks with you for our audience?
I don't think so. Like you said, while I was on active duty, I taught at West Point. Finished my doctorate before I left the Army and went into higher ed, and spent some time in some civilian schools, and then finally the Staff College and Army University, and retired out of there a couple of years ago. So life has been enjoyable.
So unlike most of us, you've at least retired twice now.
Yes.
And continued to work and continued to develop. Tell us, why would somebody like you, who's already got 20 plus years of active duty in the United States Army, why would you go on and get a PhD? Why would you continue to develop yourself?
Well, while I was teaching at West Point, it became obvious to me that higher education was probably where I wanted to go. I really enjoyed teaching the cadets. I had finished my master's degree. So when after Desert Storm, the Army brought me back to teach at Staff College. And while I was teaching history there, I finished my doctorate because I had talked to some folks in the world of higher ed, said a doctorate's the union card. And so I finished it. And when I retired from active duty, it's what got me the chance to actually go and work in university and got me on the path to be the dean at Staff College, which was kind of, to me, the height of my career and the job that I really wanted.
So, Jim, for our audience, most don't know what the Staff College is. What the heck does the Army University and the Staff College do?
Well, the Staff College has been around since 1881. Most major militaries have professional military education systems. And the United States Army has probably the most robust professional education system of any military anywhere on the planet. And it has 2 graduate schools. One of those is the Staff College, the other is the War College. The Staff College is for mid-career officers from all the services. And it is a leadership education center, along with teaching planning and some other things that are important to military careers. It focuses on creating organizational leaders. Up till then, officers have really been individual leaders. You know, they've been able to see they can put all the folks they're leading in front of them and see them. When they leave the staff college, now they're going to go to much larger organizations. And so that's where the Army makes the pivot from individual leadership to organizational leadership. And at the War College, where we do captains and majors, the War College does lieutenant colonels and colonels. A much smaller group goes there. Our staff college is known to be one of the best in the world. Very few colleges have 28 graduates who were heads of state. Leavenworth has 27 internationals who have become heads of state and 1 U.S., Dwight Eisenhower. And so it's a little known jewel that sits on the plains outside of Kansas City. And it's well known in the military across the world. I was just in DC with military academics from 18 different African countries, and they all know Leavenworth, and they're all interested in what's going on at Leavenworth.
That's what I always found most interesting. And again, I got 1,000 questions based upon some of the things you just said, but from a personal standpoint, when I would find myself in Romania representing the Army or representing the Department of Defense to a chief of defense of, the head of their military, or even, as you said, senior political leaders would walk up and very, very quickly point at their pin that they had attended the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And to them, it was a badge of honor that they had been selected to go there. Because as you well know, those countries that we partner with, they send their best, their absolute best, usually their best officer at that rank in time. And so the criticality of what it does, not just for the Army, but like you said, for the other services who attend, for the Department of Defense and for international relations. And we also have members of State Department and FBI and Marshal Services. And so it's truly a joint interagency school. And like I said, most people hear the word Fort Leavenworth, they think prison. When you and I hear Fort Leavenworth, we think the center of the universe for education. Now, saying that, you mentioned first, we have the best educational system in our Army than any other Army in the world. And we have one of the greatest educational institutions right there, Fort Leavenworth. Is that conjecture? Or is that a fact? How do you know such things?
I believe it's a fact because institutions continue to send from other militaries, continue to send their graduates to Leavenworth. I mean, the Brit Staff College at Shrivenham, twice a year, they fly the entire Army Staff College to Leavenworth to spend time with the students and the faculty there. That's a big investment. And, I happen to believe it's true. I remember talking to an Australian general officer. He had come back to talk to our internationals, and he was talking about being in Afghanistan and in a room with 23 general officers, none of them U.S. And of those 23, 20 had been at Leavenworth in a 2-year period. And so it tells you the senior leadership across the world in other militaries who are educated at Leavenworth is a pretty significant group.
Yeah, I agree. And being a retired general officer, I can't think of any foreign school that I had aspired to go to because of a reputation other than our own. And so it's interesting that, because I think most people don't understand or don't appreciate or have never even heard that the United States Army is so invested in developing its team. I heard it, interesting enough, from a civilian artificial intelligence company recently, said the difference in the military world, specifically the Army, and the civilian private sector is that the Army consumes its own talent. So it recruits its talent, it develops that talent, and it employs that talent, in many cases, over a 30-year lifespan. And so they have to get it right along that journey. But I think what's interesting for people to understand is that there's this continued need for lifelong learning, not just while you're in the military, but afterwards, which you've clearly stayed in that mindset as you've gotten out of the Army twice. to do such things. Why do you think that's so critical? Why is it that every couple of years in the Army, officers and senior non-commissioned officers are pulled out of their jobs and required to go to school to continue to develop?
Well, I've always been, I always keep going back to something Mark Milliron said at a conference I was at. He talked about an end-to-end learning pathway. And that was his term at the time. He was working at the Gates Foundation in their post-secondary higher ed kind of world. And in essence, that's what the Army does, is from the time you come in the Army until the time you leave, there is a specified learning pathway with a number of schools you have to go to and self-development along the way. I found that the officers who take the time to do the self-development piece, not just attend the schools they're required to attend, but the self-development piece, are those that, to me, stand out. Those that develop themselves intellectually. The Army can be an intellectual place or an anti-intellectual place, depending on who you're with and where you're at. But, I think most people in the civilian world would be surprised to know just how educated the Army Officers Corps is. The vast majority of Army officers have graduate degrees. And that is not true in the civilian world. But most civilian folks who have no dealing with the military, I don't think that's their image of a military officer.
Yeah. I mean, just like you, recently somebody said they'd never heard of something you articulated to somebody who actually does what you and I do for a living, which is executive coaching and team building. And you were talking about strategy, and you gave them an example of something that's common for you and I in our educational development and our operational experience was a technique or an idea that was unusual for them. For me, talking to senior executives, I'm normally surprised, one, at some that don't believe that development for their team is critical to the success of the company. They believe that it's the success is all based upon what they do personally. And so what I try to do is give them options to look at and see if those options can open up their company to greater growth and expansion by empowering their employees, by investing in that development. But I also find it very interesting, the culture of a company where the leader does invest in the workforce by doing what we were taught and trained to do in the Army for our teams, as opposed to somebody who says, it's not my responsibility to develop my team. If they can't meet the requirements that I place on them, I'll just replace them with another person. And what I'm always interested in is seeing the effect that has on the rest of the workforce. Any thoughts on that?
It brings me back to a conversation that I had many times. I used to attend an organization at the Harvard Graduate School of Education called the Learning Innovation Laboratory. And it had MIT was involved, Harvard was involved. The Staff College, Army Staff College and War College were involved. CIA University was involved. And then most of the rest of it was chief learning officers from a variety of companies. Cisco, Amazon, Procter & Gamble, a whole group that you would know. And we used to talk about the end-to-end learning pathway that I mentioned earlier and the professional development process the Army uses. And they looked at me just in shock. The idea that you would spend that much time developing talent, because their approach was, well, if I need a new CEO, I'll go buy one. Our approach was, no, we have to grow them because it's a cultural issue. It's not something that you can just go and get somebody from IBM and have them come in and be the chief staff of the Army. But IBM might go get somebody from Cisco to become the CEO there. And so they just couldn't imagine that kind of development. So their model was different. Their model was, we just go hire talent. But I would find smaller companies who believed that no, I mean, we need to create the talent from the workforce we have. And so, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. The Army does it for very specific reasons. But I mean, now that I'm in a slightly different world, I see people approaching it differently. And, one is the very simplistic, I just go hire the talent I need. And the other is, no, I can take folks who already have internalized the culture of my company, right? And then I can provide them with developmental opportunities, with training opportunities, and get them the technical competency that they need to go along with. They are already woven into the culture of my company.
Yeah. Let's talk about that, because I want to set the other one on a shelf. I understand that one. I don't agree with it. I think it's a tremendous waste of time and effort. But there are certain leader styles that's required within that design. And people at that level, can they be developed if that's how they've grown up? And what I've found is in the private sector, maybe you don't waste a lot of time there. So let's talk about that leader that you and I gravitate to, who understands the power of investing in their people, that understands that their leadership style of having a workforce with a philosophy or a culture where everyone is important, everyone has value to add to the company, and the leader is less of an autocratic type of leader, maybe more of an adaptive leader or coach who lets the team understand what their left and right limits are and move out, acknowledging that the leader is going to underwrite that risk, which is more of the environment that you and I grew up in, which leads to, my personal opinion, rapid critical thinking, problem solving, action when action is required, but also with the educational component to have the rigor associated with making informed decisions that are not a gamble, but are more of a risk. So in your experience, what kinds of leaders do you think stick out? And I'd also like you to talk a little bit about the power of the after action review with those kinds of leaders.
Well, I mean, it's funny. You talk about the autocratic leader, you talk about, the one who, I'm in charge, we're going to do it my way. And it's funny, now that I'm in the civilian world, that is what so many people expect. That, okay, that's what the military is. And I have to go, no, it's not. That's the exception. I worked for, in my time at Leavenworth, I worked for 11 different 2-stars. And I would say 10 of those were the adaptive leader that you described. The person who would give me guidance, who would support me in my path to execute what they wanted done, but who would stay out of the day-to-day fray, who would allow me to develop the folks that work for me, allow me to decide, okay, here's the task you have to do. Now tell me how you are best going to do it, not telling me how to do it. Because I mean, the reality was most of the folks I worked for were highly successful military leaders, but they knew very little about higher ed. Okay, so they were thrust into an environment that was very different than the one they were coming from. And 10 of the 11 would sit back and we would have conversations. So while they were leading me, they were learning from me. They would want to sit down and talk about higher ed. What can you do? I finally reached the point with a 3-star that I greatly respect. And he would look at me and go, Dean, can I do that? Well, no, sir, you can't. Well, okay, well, what can I do? I mean, here's a 3-star who's one of the dominant men in the United States Army, but he came to understand that there's right ways and wrong ways to do it in a different environment. I mean, he was incredibly adaptive in the way that he did things. And so, you know, I think Army leaders, successful Army leaders, are generally that adaptive leader that you refer to. You know, every situation you go into is different. I used to tell students at Leavenworth that if they only learned one thing while they were there, if they learned to think critically at a higher level, then we'd been successful. Because the reality was, I couldn't tell them where they were going to be in 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they could be anywhere in the world because the world changes fast. But if we could teach them to think and teach them to solve problems, then they could leave whatever formation they needed to leave in whatever culture they needed to lead it to accomplish the tasks. And so that, you know, that ability to think critically, and I saw it in those 10 leaders that I had in the 16 years I was at Staff College. They're thrust into totally new environments. You were one of those. Okay. You were excuse my language, kick-ass, BCT commander. You had done all the things Army officers needed to do, but you'd never led a university. And so it was a totally new environment, but yet you adapted to that new environment. Okay. And you thrived in it.
Yeah, I think what I've learned more now that I'm continuing my lifelong learning and working on my doctoral degree at age 62, I'm learning more about the types of leadership styles that we took for granted. I think my favorite author, Dan Goldman, who talks about emotional intelligence, you don't think of him talking too much about leadership, but in his little tiny pamphlet called Leadership and the Power of Emotional Intelligence, he talks about, he defines 6 different kinds of leadership styles. And that's interesting. But what was profound to me was he said, an average leader has 1 or 2 styles. A good leader is able to use 3 or 4 styles. An exceptional leader uses all 6 styles and knows when to apply them. He compares it to a golfer. You wouldn't pay 17 holes with 1 club or 18 holes with 1 club. You have to use the whole bag in order to be a professional golfer. And when I read that, I thought, wow, that's pretty profound. And it's kind of what we were taught was there were certain leadership styles necessary for the given conditions. But now that I'm learning more about styles and theories of leadership, the adaptive leader is one that I really find intriguing because the way it's defined is an adaptive leader understands there's really 2 components of what they do. And I think this is where you and I did this well at Army University under your tutelage, was get the systems of what the company or the organization is supposed to do, get those right, get them routine. In the Army, we call it doing routine things done routinely. So systems and processes and policies and procedures for the mundane things that just have to happen to keep the machine operating at top efficiency and performance. If the leaders can get that right and it's running itself, they then, as the definition of adaptive leader is, they can get up on the balcony of their organization and they can look at its totality and see, are there domain issues between parts of the factory floor, if you would? Is one providing poor quality of stuff to another that's leading to a bad product? Is there a breakdown in the shift layover? Is there a problem in the alignment of the classes and when the papers are due? You get up on the balcony, you can see that, and you can fix the more operational level problems and get out of the tactical. But more importantly, you can then see the strategic picture. And the more of your team you can bring up there with you to see that view, the more the company can lean forward and adapt to changes that are coming. They can see and sees opportunities quicker. They can see, anticipate, and diffuse issues quicker. And they can see where to take the company when others who are too busy, these don't develop anybody, don't bring anybody with you, leaders who are down in the fray every day, they don't see the train wreck as it's approaching. And so I like the adaptive leadership side of this because it empowers those employees to do the day to day, and it teaches people how to think. But specifically within those two arenas, the balcony is in between. The other arena is forming a team to tackle an opportunity, forming a team, a tiger team, if you would, to go after potential problems and solve these wicked problems. If you have a really good one, solve more than one problem with a single solution. Getting those teams trained and educated and developed to do that, who come from your normal workforce, form them for a specific requirement and send them off and look at stuff. Now, the Army, we call them red teams or red teaming as a concept. I know the school was there at Leavenworth. I know you've had some contact with it, but I'm interested in your thoughts on adaptive leadership and the power of red teaming or tiger teams, as civilians call it.
Well, it's interesting, Chris. I'll harken back again to my experience at Harvard, because we got in this conversation with these chief learning officers from across the country and actually, across the globe. And they were really interested in this idea of two things: red teaming, because they had heard about it, and after action reviews that you mentioned earlier. Corporations, they would tell me, because I had not spent time in corporate America, that corporations could get very much tunnel vision. They could get to a point where they had laid out a path, and that's the path they were going to take. And nobody wanted to argue with the CEO or the CFO or the COO. If it came out of the C-suite, it was right. And you end up on that path. The automobile company that thinks EVs are a flash in the pan, they're not going anywhere. But the red team idea is one where you have someone. I mean, we used to train people at Red Team University to be the person who sits there and looks at a plan and punches holes in it. So they look at it not from the same perspective as the team that's doing the planning, but whether you want to say from the enemy side, or if they're just playing devil's advocate, okay, to someone whose task is to show you where things won't work or where things will come up short. And some companies don't like it. They think it's negative. Okay. But, the CLOs of these really large companies said, we have to do that, because sometimes culturally, you get stuck in going down the path that, okay, that's the Walmart way, and that's what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
But they had learned this from the Army, that having someone who will look at it and go, no, wait a minute, hold on, are we, that we're taking that as an assumption. Is that a true assumption? I mean, can we really use that? Use assumptions in place of facts, but is that a good assumption? And if that assumption's wrong, what will that do to us?
Yeah.
And so, and the other side of it was the AAR side is, when you finish something, goes well, doesn't go well, you do an after action review to see what happened, why it happened, how it can be better. And in the Army, as I was growing up in it in the mid 70s and 80s, I mean, that was a way of life. You did an after action review after everything.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a very, very productive, high quality organization, and we would do an AAR, but the Army's tendency, from my opinion, was to be overly critical of ourselves. It was like nothing had gone well. No, things had gone well, but well, that's great. They should go well. But what about the things that didn't, and how can we make them better? Because getting better was always the path forward that we were looking for.
Yeah. And in both of these cases, I think what's critical to point out to our listeners is the red team or the after act, the people who led the red team or the individual, we school trained them. We put them and certified them to understand the rigor associated and the format associated with how to approach that. But we also chose an individual with the right mindset and the right ability to feel there's a trust when someone is asked, look at my plan and pick it apart. Okay. And it's not considered a negative thing. It's not considered something where you're insulting anybody. You're exposing holes and weaknesses that you can't see when you develop things. Everything that we develop as humans, because we get that tunnel vision when we do it with, especially if we do it by ourselves, like a CEO that has no team, you can get that tunnel vision you're talking about. You can also, in environments with leadership teams, get those who are extremely extroverted to drive the discussion, when in fact there's counter information in that team from someone who's more introverted, who's not going to speak up in front of the group, depending upon the level of trust. And so the teaching part and the personality part and the emotional intelligence of that individual or group of individuals is critical based upon the culture that's in the environment. Same is true with the after action review. There is a format. There are many formats for after action reviews, but the key to it is the leader has to be vulnerable enough to accept the criticism in order for the company or the organization to grow and get better. And you said 70s, 80s, I can say 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we still use that process. And it can be brutal to a leader's ego, but that's good, because that helps to create the humble leader who begins to understand that they're more of a servant than they are an actual leader, and they're trying to get the people right. If they can get the people right and the people feel safe in making decisions to do the right thing, then you're there. I think in both cases, the after action review, and especially the red teaming, when I was younger, we did a lot more defensive strategy because of the Cold War in Germany against the great Soviet Union that was going to attack us with 10 times the amount of equipment and artillery and tanks that we had. We spent a lot of time figuring out how to defend, for the active force to hold as long as we could until all the reserves could get there and we could win World War III. Very early on at our training centers, where we go out and get beat up by an opposing force, and we conduct very brutal after action reviews to show you where you're weak. One of the coaches said, hey, look, you think what you have is perfect. You think the defense that you have is going to accomplish the mission. He says, come with me. Let's go outside and look back at your defense from the enemy's perspective. And I thought, there's nothing out there that I'm going to see that I can't see from here. Well, guess what? When he walked me out there and got me in hill and we looked back, I could see there's a hole, there's a hole, there's two things that are not supporting each other. This is what the enemy sees. The enemy knows exactly how to defeat me. And that's why it only took them the day before 20 minutes to get through my defense. And hopefully the next day, it only takes them 40 minutes to get through my defense and eventually never get through my defense. But that's what a red teaming individual in your organization who feels trust can do, is get you outside the wire and look back and say, look, boss, it sounds great and looks great from that perspective, but from out here, here's a problem, here's a problem, and here's a problem. And sometimes it requires someone like you and I to do that for organizations, where you can teach a CEO to build that vulnerability to understand that's not criticism, that's help. And that's what their team should be doing for them.
If I could just step in a slightly different direction, Chris, you were talking about the adaptive leader and who makes the trains run on time, and then they're on the balcony and they can look at broader. And it made me really think of what we did at Leavenworth and in the years subsequent to you, because we got the trains running on time. We had the the right systems, and we had lots of resources. But, Chris King, my predecessor, and I came to you and said, we can do this better. The Army can do education better. And we kind of recommended that the Army create a university. We had said that to other general officers, and they had just stared at us. We said it to you, and you jumped on it, and you went to Bob Brown, who jumped on it, our 3-star, and created the university in the same way. Because I had the right leaders, we were able to look at it and say, the college can do a lot more than it's doing now. At the time, the college had 1 degree, and we had 3 different programs that gave the same degree. And I had a leader who said, Jim, go do what you got to do. I'll give you cover. And all of a sudden, we created 3 different master's degrees. We eventually created a 4th. We saw how the college could be used to help non-commissioned officers. And we developed an undergrad degree in leadership workforce development for our non-commissioned officers. It's that ability to get up on the balcony. Okay, everything else is going to run. You got the right people running the systems. And and I'm actually, thinking in my mind now, Lewis and Clark Center, get up on the 3rd level, and you can look out at the atrium. And that's the image that's in my mind right now. And because we're able to do that, the college is doing so much more for the Army now. And that's because, as you said, that adaptive leader who gives his people space. All right. And, the trains are running on time. What else can we do to make the organization better?
Yeah.
And in this case, we were able to do that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was really cool for me personally, because watching you guys take the ball and run with it, was to throw in the Army Press. Because I had one of the few, you guys taught me when I was a student there that a professional writes about their profession. They add to the learning, they add to the knowledge of their profession. And that's what they do. That's why we were considered professionals. And so I published, which was very difficult to do. And it was difficult because there wasn't a mechanism for that. We advocated for it, but we didn't provide the potentiality for that to happen. And so the Army Press was something that created itself within that design. But I think what's interesting is that happened, that adaptive leadership style happened because of the construct of what we call mission command, or as I call it out here, is the idea, the executive leadership model, how to think, not what to think, but how to think. And I think what was profound when I was there was I was trying to understand this new dogma that we were advocating for, which was for the leader, a leader-centric organization, but the leader spends more time thinking about what it is that's presented to them. You guys gave me an opportunity, that it was an opportunity to solve many, many, many problems. One opportunity, one solution to solve many things. We eventually started calling that multiplicity of effect. And so why solve one problem when you can solve multiple with the same solution? And that came out of better understanding what the heck I was supposed to be doing and what you were advocating for me to do. And so understanding and then visualizing that and then describing that those first 3 steps of the executive leadership model, to me was mind changing. It was my ability to suddenly clearly see what you were saying. And so that visualization, that understanding, taking the time to do that. Like you said earlier, I hadn't run the university before, and I was told my job was leader development and education. And so I had done something I'd been taught when I was younger, to ask why. Why am I responsible to do that? What can I actually do? Who's in charge of this? You guys would say, hey, Chris, we don't need this curriculum anymore. We have too many hours piled on. We need to have less curriculum, but do it better, do less things better, which became our definition of rigor. Why do a bunch of stuff sloppy when you can do one or two things very, very well. And so that became a understanding. But when I asked who has the authority to do stuff, and you guys said I did, I questioned that to my higher and to their higher, and eventually learned, guess what? We did have the authority. So I understood what authorities we had. I understood what resources we had. I could visualize what you guys were saying to bring it all under one umbrella of accreditation. And then you were able to describe to me those potential positive effects. Then I could go to the fourth, fifth, and sixth steps of the executive leadership model, which were to direct what we do, because I had the authority to help you. So I could direct it so you had the resources and authority to move out. I then would lead by listening, going around and looking to see, did we get it right? Because that was the sixth step, which was to assess, was this really a good idea, or are we going down a path that was not attainable? And if it was assessed to be wrong, then I could better understand and go back to the beginning of the process. And so I think there, for the first time, the authorities, the environment, the culture of what we were doing all came together in a really unique way. And so that's what I try to talk to leaders about in executive coaching, is understanding that model. Do you, before you tell your team to do something, do you truly understand what it is you want them to do? Do you truly understand the scope of the problem, understand the real left and right limits of the opportunity? And can you visualize that and see how that affects your organization, and describe it to those you lead in order to turn and direct? And too many people don't understand something. They think they know something and they go straight to direct. And what happens is they send a lot of people down rabbit holes.
Yeah, if you'll let me again change lanes without signaling here.
Sure.
You mentioned lifelong learning earlier, and you mentioned that you're working on your doctorate. And I mean, you're an example of lifelong learning, very successful, retired 2-star, now running your own company, but yet you're going back to school. Okay, I've had a PhD for 25 years. I've retired twice, failed retirement another time, and I'm back to doing things. But I ended up consulting with an AI company and understood that I had no clue what the data scientists did that I talked to. And so, I decided to go and get a certificate in artificial intelligence strategy. And I went back to school for 12 weeks. And, folks look at me and go, you have a PhD. Why'd you go back to school? Well, it's because I don't know enough about this one topic. And this one topic's important. And, oh, by the way, it's going to be important to all of us here as we move forward. Yeah. And so, you and I are both examples of the importance of lifelong learning. I mean, many people will look at us and go, well, you've reached your peak. You don't need to go take more classes. And for me, I was used to teaching them for 25 years. And being a student again was a challenge, I have to admit. But it's I think we're examples of what people need to be open to doing. Yeah. If there's something out there that you need to know more about, there's someplace you can find at a community college. Or for me, I happen to use Cornell University's eCornell platform. But I mean, if there's something that's important to you, you can continue to learn. I found myself kind of marking time, kind of stuck in a place where I didn't feel like I was moving forward. And going back to school helped me to start moving forward again, learning new things. To me, it was energizing.
Yep.
And, you and I talk on a fairly regular basis, and I think your studies are energizing you.
Oh yeah. Yeah, without a doubt. And we've got to close here, Jim, but I will say to cap your point, here's two old guys doing a podcast. Neither one of us could probably even define the podcast a few years ago. But we're vulnerable enough to admit it, and we apply our time and our effort toward it to learn more about it in order to stay current, stay relevant, and move forward. And that's the key to executive coaching. You got to stay relevant. You have to be competent. You can get the leadership part right, but you got to be competent to understand what the company needs to do and where it needs to go. And so, Jim, I appreciate you doing the inaugural podcast with me today. And I got to tell you, we didn't even come close to scratching the surface of the things that I want to talk to you about in the future. So hopefully you'll agree to come back again.
And I'll come back anytime you want me to, Chris.
Thanks, boss. It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
Take care.